Okay, we're talking about the problem of sex today. Hopefully, like hell, we'll make it as unawkward and as comfortable as we can. Unawkward, not awkward as we can. So, Christianity is rejected by many people all over the world, specifically in the Western world, because of Christianity's ethical teachings. And sex is one of those primary teachings. A lot of people deem Christianity's teaching on sex as antiquated, old-fashioned. Some people even go to extreme of calling it oppressive. And so what we have to do is we have to approach that as Christians. Like, what does the Bible, what does Jesus or God or just the Christian faith in general, what does it say about sex? Because it's a huge part of the human experience. It's something that biologically we start thinking about at a very young age. And so it's important for us. So for anybody growing up outside the church, and even for some people growing up inside the church, and maybe you've had this experience, they're convinced that God is against sex, like God is anti-sex, that he doesn't like it. I mean, everything we hear from Christian parents and our pastors, it's like sex is a negative thing. And it's drilled into us, like that dirty, nasty, vile thing called sex, save it for somebody you loved. It's like there's just this tainted view of it. What was the Mean Girls?
Yeah, the quote from Mean Girls is that like he's in like a sex ed class and he's like, don't have sex or you will get pregnant and you will die.
Like that's
and it's like that extreme is kind of what our society personifies.
Yeah, at least the Christian faith. It's like sex is that bad, nasty thing. So, let's just avoid the topic altogether. Right. However, if you begin reading your Bible for yourself, if you begin actually discovering some of these realities, you find that it's actually quite the opposite. There's actually a quite different perspective of sex that the Bible has. And so God is the one who created it. He's the one who encourages it. And so tonight, Darian, which I think everybody watching this would know is my wife,
hopefully.
But Darian's going to help me address this because it's a big thing. But again, anti-sex, is that the Christian faith?
Yeah. And so The Problem of God, the book that a lot of the material we've covered in this series has come from, I opened it up and like the very first page of this chapter on the problem of sex quotes Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood. And she said that Christians are moralists who promote self-denial and suppression because of their teaching on abstinence before marriage. And the word self-denial really stood out to me because it's exactly what we've been called to do, is to deny ourselves. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more. The first thing I wanted to kind of open up my little portion here with is talking about where maybe as Christians or as parents or as Christians who have parents, but even from a secular perspective, is where have we've been failed in the topic of sexuality. And that's something I have a little bit of experience on. And as some of you know, I have a master's in family sciences. And so this is one of the things I study pretty heavily in my academic studies. And one of the things I did in my undergraduate is I looked a lot at the discussions parents are having with their kids about sex, and where maybe we haven't talked to our kids or have had parents talk to us about sex. So by a show of hands, if you're comfortable, how many of you had parents who talked to you about sex? Okay. So that's more than average.
My hand's down.
I can raise my hand. I'm like thinking back, I'm like, I don't know if that was really talked about it was, but I sat in a class my sophomore, junior year of college with 40 other people at a Christian university, and like 3 people raised their hands. And I was in the class with the closest, like my best friend at the time. And I raised my hand and looked at her, and she had her hand down. She was like, my parents never talked to me about that. Her dad, was an elder in the church. Her mom, is a faithful believer. And she had older siblings, which is where a lot of her information came from. But statistically and longitudinally, we've had a lot of parents that don't talk to their kids about sex. And then I also got the opportunity to look at it from an academic perspective. So like, where is it taught in school? Just in case you guys are curious, roughly half of all states in the U.S. require some sort of sex education. I thought it was funny, only about 20 of them require it to be medically accurate, which I was like, that doesn't mean it's not medically accurate when it's not required, but I was like, why would that be across the board? But just because it's required doesn't mean it's anything more than like in 5th grade, you get anatomy and biology, and in 9th grade, you get a little bit more comprehensive class or seminar. And I know if you think back on your own time, whether you went to public school or private school, what that education looked like coming from your school, that was something that is potentially a gateway. I'm going to move slides. So it's an opportunity for dialogue. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because yes, we're a young adults group, but we may potentially be parents one day. And if we're not parents, we may be aunts and uncles one day. We may be that person, that safe person that has these conversations with people in our lives. And then again, like, why do we need to talk to kids about sexuality? So again, from a secular perspective, health perspective, parents are often the most important influence on a teen's decision about sex and relationships, more importantly than their siblings, more importantly than their friends, and more importantly than the media. Most teens say that it would be easier to make make decisions about sex if they could talk openly and honestly with their parents. But then we also have the non-secular version, is like, what perspectives on truth do we have the opportunity to speak into our children's lives when we have the opportunity to talk to them about these things? And again, because teens who talk to their parents about sex are more likely to put off sex until a later age, and then they're also more likely to make healthy choices. So using birth control, preventing STDs or STIs, if they choose to have sex. So that's, again, like a big gateway where in the lifetime of this topic, statistically, parents have fallen short. And again, parents as Christians or Christian parents have fallen short in this way. But on the flip side, I did look, and it says that there's been a shift, at least since like 2014 data has shown, that about 82% of parents say they've talked to their kids about topics. And then most mothers and fathers say that they're willing and able to talk to their kids about sexual health. However, surveys show that some parents are still uncomfortable talking about harder topics. And one that really stood out to me is how to say no. And so, and not to come at this from like an abstinence stance, because that's not the road we're going down right now. We can talk about that later. But like, that's a hard conversation to have, but it's not just a conversation about abstinence. It's also a conversation about safety. And so those are hard conversations that are not yet being had. And then again, going back to the opportunity that we may have as parents or as, again, like a loved one of a teen or a child, we've probably seen, and like Payton just said, and like the quote I just gave, is that we've raised kids in teens in an atmosphere where sex is taboo, so don't do it. Mm-hmm. And if you will, you'll die. Like, if you do it, you die. Yeah. And then there's also a little bit that I'll talk about later in terms of virginity culture and the topic of kind of like redemption. So
yeah, so we have to set it up with the problem. Like, this is the problem, is that we weren't taught about sex the appropriate way, or many people haven't. Christians are afraid to talk about it. And it's a large part because they don't think the Bible talks about sex. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, we're not going to talk about something that's not there. Like, it's something that happens in the privacy of a room and needs to stay there. But that's false. Like, the Bible talks a lot about sex. So 1 Corinthians 7:5, Paul, who was an avid writer for the Christian faith right after Jesus, he says this. He's talking specifically to husbands and wives. And he says, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. And then come back together. Again, we're talking about sex here. Come back together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Like here we're seeing, like, sex is more than just for like procreation. It's more than just like, okay, husband and wife, they come together, they do the deed, and then they don't talk about it. Like sex is something that's supposed to be enjoyed. It's something that's supposed to bring husband and wife together in marriage, in that covenant relationship. It's something that's supposed to keep them from temptation. It's supposed to protect them from outside forces. And so for Paul, sex is a very positive thing. And then in the Old Testament, the Old Testament explicitly talks about the joys and pleasures of an active sex life. That's why Proverbs 5:18 says, rejoice in the wife of your youth. You can take that quite literally, like rejoice in her, like rejoice in the process of sex, in that sexual relationship with her. In fact, it was so important in ancient Israel, this relationship between a husband and wife, the sexual relationship, that when a soldier was married, he was actually required to stay home for a year so that he could enjoy his wife. Like, it was that important for them. Like, and that involved sex, but it also involved just like bonding together initially as newly married. And so the Bible never talks about, like, don't talk about that, you dirty kids. Like, it never looks at it as perverted. It never looks at it as skewed. And this is, we're going to talk about this a little bit. This is the difference between the Bible's culture and our culture. It's because we have shifted the symbol and the significance of sex away from what it was intended. The Bible is very focused on it, and whenever it is in its natural, beautiful place, it can be talked about. It can be enjoyed. It's not dirty and nasty. It's like Proverbs 5:18 through 19. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. This is why in other places in the Bible, like Song of Solomon, Jewish boys were not allowed to read the Song of Solomon or the Psalms of Solomon until they came of age, because it's so erotic. The Bible is filled with it, I guess is the point. And so because it talks so openly about sex and it paints it as a beautiful thing, we have to stop shying away from it as well. That's why we're talking pretty bluntly about it now. But it's also why, as you grow up and you have kids, as you talk with, I know some people are thinking about getting married. Some of you have been hurt before in past relationships. Some of you are married. I mean, we're all over the spectrum, even in this room. And sex is going to be at the center of our life in many ways, in our relationships especially. And so we got to talk about it, but we have to talk about it in its appropriate context and not avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting too that you bring up other faiths, because we are talking, and I, just spoke on how Christianity has, how parents or Christian parents have failed their kids. But in other religions, like when we look to them and they're basing these things off the Old Testament, especially like the Jewish faith, I have shared with you before that my master's thesis was on premarital counseling, and one of the things that is like explicitly covered and like education is based on in the Jewish faith is like one of the things that they go through in their premarital counseling is like they sit down and someone teaches them. They have some pretty strict rituals and expectations about sex inside of their marriages in the Jewish faith, but like that they have not only when you get married, but also as you're younger, there are some pretty explicit times where they're said like, we need to talk about what is happening with your body or what is going to happen when you become man and wife. So the next thing is the value of sex in marriage. And I wanted to talk on this briefly, but then I also realized that only some of us are married in here. But I guess it is important to create this as a foundation for why it is important within a marriage. So 40% of married people have sex twice a week, compared to 20% of single or cohabiting. There's a lot of really interesting research on cohabiting in terms of like living together before you're married, and the satisfaction found in marriage if you live together before you're married.
And can I just say, just to set this up, this is countering these statistics that we're about to read to you. It's countering the idea that sex is kind of tainted within marriage. Like culture paints this idea that
of monogamy even being monogamy is not really as fun.
Yeah, like the single life where you can just like openly and freely have sex. Like that is the exciting sex. And you have it more, and it's more, provocative and exotic or whatever. The statistics actually point the opposite.
Yeah,
so the first
and
one,
especially the second part is that, so married people are having sex more often.
Yeah.
But 40% of married women and 50% of married men say that their sex life was emotionally and physically satisfying. Outside of a marriage, or in single women, it's only 30% of women and 38% of men. So that statistic goes down pretty significantly in terms of like the pleasure that they are getting out of sex, and also the frequency of how often people are having sex.
Yeah.
So the myth of our culture is that the single life is a life of great sex and the height of pleasure. But that's simply a lie. Promoting marriage will make a lot more happy men and women. And the reason for that is that good sex is hard work and we need time to get it right. Maximum pleasure takes the amazing and exclusive relationship within a marriage. So again, like what Payton was saying, is that we if we look at our culture, it promotes, I did some studying up too on, again, like looking at it from a perspective of educating a teen. And one of the things the gentleman who wrote the book said was, if you're a parent of a teenager and you don't think they're being fed information about sex, like go look at the songs they listen to, go look at the movies they watch, go look at their friends they're hanging out with. So again, I put all this out there to say, like, sex within a marriage is important, but it's also statistically better.
And I don't want to blow over what you just said about like sex. The reason sex in marriage is so significant is because hard work is backed up behind it. It's not just something that's freely given and freely accessed. It's something that is supported on a foundation of hard, committed work with a single partner.
Right. And I guess that goes on to kind of talk about God's design within sex, which we will talk more about, but that God, again, designed man and woman to be together and designed sex as well, and said, again, with his creation, that it was very good. And so I had someone who spoke into my life from a young age, and one of the things she told me, and she shared her testimony, and it was this really kind of beautiful capture of how, again, I mentioned like virginity culture and how a lot of people have pointed to the toxicity of that and where it roots from in Christianity, and that there are a lot of people who feel like that is the unforgivable sin because it's a physical sin. And I get that, because it is something that our society plays so much into, is that like, well, once your virginity is gone or it's been taken, you can't get that back. However, she spoke again on her testimony, and this was when I was going to summer camp. And she shared her testimony that the year before she had come to camp, and she was a counselor. So she was about 3 weeks out from her wedding. And at camp that year before, she had been just like really deeply convicted that she and her fiance, I don't know if they were living together, but they were having sex, and they were, they were about to get married like 3 weeks away. And she felt really convicted and said, I know this sounds crazy. I know we've been having sex our whole relationship, but for the next 2 weeks before our wedding, I don't want to have sex, and like made that really intentional time. And she shared this just amazing story. And what really stood out to me was this, is that she said, you can have sex all you want, but you will never truly experience intimacy until you are having sex within a marriage. And that, again, she went on to speak into like, I know some of you in here have had sex, and that's okay, because you've never experienced intimacy the way God created it to be had. And I went to Payton and I was like, so I had this really, beautiful thing, and it's spoken a lot into my life, but I've also thought, is this like theologically sound? And again, it goes back to creation, that like God designed us to be intimate with one another, but he designed that intimacy to happen within marriage. So I do feel like that's true. And I do feel like that speaks to the accountability of saving sex for within a marriage, and saving sex for that one person you are married to.
Yeah, and to bounce off the idea of sex within a marriage and its theological implications, I mean, the image that we are given throughout the Bible of our relationship with God is the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. It's that covenantal relationship. And so the significance of that you can find in your sexual relationship, but just that emotional relationship with your partner is supposed to be some kind of connection that we're supposed to have with God as well. We're not talking about having sex with God, but we're talking about that emotional connection that is there, that intimacy that's reflected. That's supposed to reflect our relationship with God as well. So there is huge theological implications there. So the Bible's pretty clear, right? Statistics are pretty clear. Like, sex is an extraordinary thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's created by God. Sex within a marriage is unlike anything you can get outside of it. It's not just meant for procreation. It's meant for pleasure. So there's a lot of implications that we have to kind of restructure for ourselves. Sex is not a bad thing whenever it's made and done within the appropriate context. And so we have to redeem it from our culture. We have to redeem it from all the ways that it's been abused and misused in our movies, in our music, in our own lives, in the news, in our experiences. We have to kind of pluck it out of what we're used to seeing it in and try to set it back into the right puzzle piece. But at the same time, so there's two extremes. There's the sex is bad, never have it. And then there's the other extreme we have to try to avoid as well, and that where a good thing becomes a god. And this happens all over the place. Sex can become a god in our life, but so can wealth. So can popularity. So can our social media feeds. So can the degrees we have on our wall. I mean, all of these things can become idols, can become gods in our lives. And so we have to make sure sex doesn't become one of those as well. So that perspective sees sex not just as a good thing, but the ultimate good. It's a liberating kind of sex. It's my definition of good. It's what makes me good.
And some people do it with sex, but some people do it with a lot of other things too.
Yeah. Sex is just one of them.
Yeah, and we idolize and we tend to worship things and make center of our universe things that God has warned us about. And then we pull the verses about like warnings about sex, and that's where we then turn like sex is bad. Yeah,
but the sexual revolution that came about in the 70s and the 80s or 60s and 70s, that was a freeing, a liberating sex that we think of sex as something that frees us. It brings peace on earth. It brings people together. And it is the thing that fulfills my mental unsteadiness. Like, it's the thing that's going to unite us. And that's where that mentality comes from. And so we cannot look at sex as the ultimate good. It's just a part of the goodness. So Darian's going to talk just a second about the effects of liberating sex.
Right. So when we liberate sex, this is like, it's kind of a confusing term to say, like the liberating sex. I'm like, sex can be liberating, but not the way when I first read this. So, having liberating sex and kind of just going with what our culture says, going with what feels good and what feels right and what satisfies us physically, is what we mean by liberating sex. And then on the flip side of that is a disciplining sex. And that is something, again, like you talked about, that within a marriage, it's not just a commitment, but it's work. So I want to start with this quote. This is the first time in U.S. history that our sons are having less education than their fathers. When confronted with an abundance of women, men become promiscuous and unwilling to commit to a monogamous relationship. Surprise. Today, well-educated, empowered, successful women don't want lame, slacker husbands, and most men don't want to feel inferior to their wives. Will this push us into becoming more of an individual rather than a family-based society, which is like a giant conversation that I have in my field. Easy access to sex affects men's motivation to achieve their life goals. And given the choice between masturbating over online pornography and going out on a date with a real girl, that is to say, a girl who doesn't look like a porn star and isn't wearing lingerie, more and more young men say that they prefer online porn. Again, surprise. And that just goes to, again, the topic of disciplining sex versus liberating sex. And the quote that I brought up at the beginning is that we're called to deny ourselves. We're called to discipline ourselves. And then once we have that relationship within a marriage, we're also called to discipline that, going back to the verses that Payton mentioned, is like, don't deny your wife, or don't deny each other. And many of the other verses you'll find on sex talk about the healthy expectation of sex within a relationship. trying to think if I had another thought on that, but it's gone now.
Yeah, so the idea of liberating sex, the easy access to sex, and where we're primarily seeing that is in pornography. And more we're seeing men choosing that easy option out. It's that easy access to sex. But what we're seeing is that it's not having that freeing effect that many people who think liberating sex will have. That I can just get it and have easy access to it whenever I want.
And this isn't a new problem too. This isn't like, statistically, yes, pornography is on the rise, but the access to sex is not a problem. And this book covered this, and this was a statistic I was not aware of, talking about like tracking old statistics and going back and surveying older people. They talked about the number of men through the 40s and 50s who had sought sex through a prostitute. And then the number of women, I believe in the 20s through 40s, they said 1 in 50 women reported to being a prostitute at some point. So it's like, it's just a different avenue that we're having this instant gratification of like, I don't need to seek monogamy. I don't need to seek this the way God intended for me. I'm going to go and I'm going to take it on my own.
Yeah. So God has given us sex as a gift, right? He stitched it into history as one of the greatest and most powerful nonverbal signals that we have of unity, of love, of a covenant, of commitment to somebody else. It really is a picture of the gospel itself. If you go read Ephesians 5, you'll see what I'm talking about there. But what sex is within a marriage, it is the meshing of two souls. And what happens in it is this unspoken message. It's this act of I belong completely and totally to you. Like, we are both literally physically connected, but we're also mentally and emotionally connected to. It's two becoming one. That's how the Bible paints it for us. So what happens? So this is a question that we have to challenge here. What happens when we use this signal to mean something else? Like when we take a signal, how God designed it to be, and we turn it to something else. Well, what happens in that process is it destroys the original intention of its meaning. So let's have a little fun with this. So N.T. Wright, he's a scholar. He contends that every worldview has 4 major components to it. So whenever I say worldview, it's the way you view the world. It's your culture that you were raised in. We talked a lot about this when we talked about hell, right? There's a lot of things that affect how I view my world, where I live, color of my skin, my socioeconomic status, my friends, right? Imagine that you're putting on glasses, and we all have a pair of glasses, and we all put them on, and we all view the world through them. And people in Africa, in India, and China, they think about the world a lot differently than you do. They experience it. They have different questions than you. They relate to other people different than you. Like just having a different worldview. So N.T. Wright claims that every worldview has to go through 4 major components to develop. One, it's the stories that we tell and we experience human existence through. So think of the movies that you watch, the music that you listen to. Think of the stories, the bedtime stories you listened to when you were growing up at bedtime. Think of what guys talk about at the water cooler, how they tell stories to each other at work. Think about a family barbecue and the family gets together and you're telling stories. Like stories, how we communicate and experience the world, that shapes our worldview. It's how we view. Think about the movies you watch and then you interpret the world through that movie. Next one is questions. So the questions that we ask determine our worldview. So again, we are asking a lot different questions about sexuality. We're asking a lot different questions about God's existence than people on the other side of the world are. So the questions we ask shape our worldview. The symbols we use. So this is a symbol. This ring symbolizes something far grander, right, than just a piece of metal on my finger. Like it signifies something far deeper than that. Sex is also a symbol. Like it signifies something far grander and far more profound than the actual physical act of sex, right? So stories we tell, the questions we ask, the symbols we use, and then finally praxis, which is the reality that we live, just how we live life. Okay, so this is kind of like an ecosystem. Everything affects each other. So if you just change one of these in any area, it affects all of the others. And I believe this is the problem this is the exact issue we are having with the misuse of sex. Sex is one of the symbols, and I believe we've turned the dial on it some of what God's intention of it was and how we now define it. So if you turn on the television, you search the internet, you look at billboards, you read any magazine, we've misused and we've destroyed one of the central symbols God has given us to defining meaning in our world. And in turn, we've called into question and we've confused not just sexuality, but personhood, marriage, meaning itself. Like we've adjusted the symbol to mean something else. So instead of sex being something that happens in a sacred relationship that's supposed to symbolize our relationship with God, we've now taken it out of that space. And now it's changing the stories that we tell. You can watch a PG-13 movie and see a pretty explicit sex scene in it. Stories of affairs is now sought after than it is. There's literally a website called adultery.com, and it's a website designed for you to partner up with someone to have an adulterous relationship with. The questions we ask. Think of how our questions are changing about sexual identity. Sex, when and how and who can have it with what. Everything is shaped whenever you just shift one of these areas. And we're making that shift with sex, and it's affecting everything about us. That's why this is so important for us to talk about and to place it back into its original context.
Yeah, and within its original context, it puts us to looking at not what we talked about before is putting sex as God, but putting God as the ultimate one and the one that created sex. So, I don't have a lot to say on this, but that if you think back to every conversation that we've had as young adults on God's design for humans and the design God has for humankind, it says a lot about sex. And I think this book spoke to a lot of good things too, in terms of having someone within a marriage relationship to meet each other's needs. And going back to what you said in Ephesians 5 is that the goal is to leave your parents and to be one with your spouse. And that the two become one. And the book did a really good job of going into that, like, sex isn't always like fun and easy. And if you're seeking it outside of a marriage relationship, that's probably going to be amplified at some point. It's going to be unfulfilling. It's going to be less frequent, like I talked about statistically already. But then we also have the opportunity to look at it inside the marriage and say, how do two people work together to meet each other's needs? And I know that's not like a fun topic of conversation, but again, like the book went into satisfaction between men and women, and that for men, it's a little easier to feel satisfied in a sexual relationship, whereas women require more work. But then biologically, men find more pleasure out of pleasing a woman. And I just looked at that and was like, how do you not find that within God's design? For that to just, and again, that's speaking within typical development of two people, and that may be different between couples. But how God designed that for us to work that way and the way that we do work in a sexual relationship can only be designed by God.
Yeah. So sex is more than just something that pours from God's goodness. We talked about last week in our hell discussion. What do you have when you remove God? Well, you remove all of the joys and the blessings that come with him. Sex is one of those. So you are left joyless and without that pleasure. But just because sex is glorious and beautiful and pleasurable and filled with joy, it's not the ultimate goal. It's a means to the goal. It's a pointer. And just like, so Jesus taught about marriage, he often said that, marriage is not, he didn't often say, but he said, marriage is not something that will be in the next life. Because while it's important and it serves a purpose now, it's not going to be necessary in the life to come. And the same is true with sex. Like, sex is something that's pointing us to the glory and the joy and the fulfillment we're going to find in the next life. but it's not the means itself. It's one of the most exciting things we can do in this life, but there's something more fulfilling coming later. May not understand me completely in that, so let's talk to C.S. Lewis about it, and this is kind of the conclusion of our thought here. So C.S. Lewis, this is humorous way of talking about sex, and how it's a pointer to something greater that we're going to receive. He says, think about our present outlook about sex. What it might be like to the small boy who, being told that the sexual act was the highest bodily pleasure, that boy would immediately ask whether you ate chocolates at the same time. On receiving the answer no, he might regard the absence of chocolate as the chief characteristic of sexuality. In vain, you would tell him that the reason why lovers in their raptures don't bother about chocolate is that they have something far better to think about. But the boy knows chocolate. He doesn't know the positive thing that excludes it. And we're in the same position. We know the sexual life. We do not know, except in glimpses, the other thing which in heaven will leave no room for it. If you didn't fully grasp that, it's the idea of trying to imagine telling a boy what sex is like. Well, the boy's never had sex, but he's had chocolate, the ultimate pleasure for him. So he can't imagine sex without chocolate because that is his fulfillment. In the same way, we can't imagine heaven without sex because that's our ultimate fulfillment. But there is something far grander that we're being pointed to. We don't know the other thing, but we have pointers to it. However, instead of trying to keep people away from sex, and rather than God trying to keep people away from sex, he actually says it will draw people closer to him, which is probably the most radical idea of all. Sex is not bad, but it's something that helps us actually connect with God on a far grander and more profound level.